we go through intense training. We go through, immersive training exercises, realistic training exercises. We're used to crawling around in confined spaces with live casualties and, and working together as a team. But what I would say that the entire team, 77 of us, bonded, in a way that, none of us will be able to describe to you what that bond feels like. But I know that I've come away with 76 brothers and sisters.
Welcome back to the World Extreme Medicine podcast with myself, Owen Walker. In this episode, I'm speaking with Deb Swann on her recent deployment to Turkey and indeed the Syrian border with the UKISAR, so the UK International Search and Rescue Team, and what's been both a recent tragedy and indeed a search and rescue effort for a sizable earthquake in Turkey. Deb Swann is a member of the WEM faculty, so World Extreme Medicine faculty. She is also an ACP, so Advanced Clinical Practitioner, working in Cambridge, and indeed is a member of the UKISAR. Welcome to the podcast, Deb.
Thanks, Owen. Thanks for having me.
Great to speak with you. Debs, could I just maybe start with, this has been, speaking to you offline and just in other messages, this seems to have been probably one of the most visceral and challenging deployments that you've been involved in. Could you just maybe speak to your recent reflections on the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, so it's been it's an unprecedented earthquake, the worst in over 100 years, particularly in that region. And that was fairly evident when we landed in country. We landed in Gaziantep, a region in Turkey that was worst hit. And we were tasked to go to a city called Hatay, which is near the Syrian border. And we were one of the first international organizations to reach the city. As soon as we were on the ground, you could just see the devastation of the city. It was catastrophic.
So I suppose it's been compounded by the fact it's still the middle of winter, so there is still freezing conditions and or weather. Could you maybe speak to the conditions and maybe the wider conditions around sort of the access to water, access to indeed toilets or lack of, and just maybe some of the wider aspects you also saw?
So, apart from seeing the devastation of the buildings, which I don't think there was one building that went unscathed, they'd either pancaked or they had just fallen over, and people were sleeping on the streets, even though there were buildings that were still upright. And if they survived the earthquake and subsequent aftershocks, you potentially would be okay in those buildings. The people of Hatay were not sleeping in their buildings. They were sleeping on the streets, and the temperatures were going down to -6 at night. Up to about 10 degrees in the sun during the day. But yeah, people had no shelter and were gathering around makeshift fires, to keep warm, blankets that they could salvage from buildings. So that was evident straight away as soon as we were there. The Turkish charity AFAD were on site. They got there before us and they were putting tents up, but they didn't have enough. There were innumerable amounts of displaced people in that city.
Debs, could you speak to sort of the feeling of the team? Because, I guess the whole concept of UKISR is that it's self-sufficient. There's no burden placed on local resources because, as you said, sanitation is maybe poor, access to water is poor at these times of acute emergency. But could you speak to just the feeling of the team on seeing the scale of devastation and indeed the scale of loss?
Everyone was affected. There were a lot of people on their first deployment. So obviously they are going to be shocked by what they're seeing. And there was some old guard there who had done numerous deployments, and we were all affected by what we were seeing, what we were hearing. We are self-sufficient, like you said. We don't burden the people that are affected by this disaster. So we have accommodation, food, water, a heat source, away from this area, and we really felt for these people. They're coming up to us and begging for help, saying that they can hear someone in a building. They're frantically using diggers, hands, shovels, anything to get to their loved ones. And we had taskings. We are there to search and to rescue live casualties. So we are governed by a central organisation called the United Nations Coordination Cell. So we are tasked by those people on good intel and good evidence. So we have taskings. We're walking through the city to get to these places. But if there is good evidence that there is a live casualty in a building, we stop. The UKISAR techs assess it. They'll mark it up for other organisations to go to, or if we run the dogs over the building, over the rubble, then that's a good sign for us to stay and to start digging to find these people.
So, Debs, you mentioned the dogs, actually. Could you maybe speak to how useful they were as an adjunct to searching, and indeed as sort of companionship, really, but also very much as an adjunct to your search profile?
Yeah. So the dog we deployed with 4 dogs, and they are live scent dogs, so they're not cadaver dogs, and they are absolutely fundamental to the search and rescue effort. And we wouldn't have had the saves that we had without those dogs. They are absolutely brilliant. One of the dogs, Davy, did about 50 searches in the first 24 hours, and they're absolutely keen for it. And they love what they do. And yeah, back at the base of operations, they are little balls of morale. So they're great to have around.
So, Debs, could you maybe speak to, just to give listeners an idea of sort of the level and depth of devastation, and indeed the sort of pathology you were seeing? Could you maybe speak to sort of the injuries and or cases that were coming out and that you were seeing?
Yeah, so you have to assume that people that have been buried in rubble or entombed in a collapsed structure are going to have a fairly predictable injury pattern, perhaps. They will be dehydrated. They may well have respiratory problems, so impaired ventilation from being crushed, or they've been inhaling dust and asbestos and noxious gases. Also, they've potentially sustained trauma in the event of a collapsed structure. So, anything, limbs, chest, pelvises, anything. They'll be potentially hypovolemic from blood loss. And we also have to think about crush injury and crush syndrome. And as a medical team, we are prepared for all of those eventualities, and we monitor and treat whilst they're being dug out by the UKISAR technicians. And somebody said to me earlier today that they didn't realise that the medical team actually went into the buildings with the UKISAR techs. They thought we stood outside and waited for them to bring people out to us, and no, that's not the case. If somebody is it's a difficult rescue, then we go in and we start treating. For the man that I was involved in, he'd been trapped for 3 days. He had gone into a building to try and rescue 2 people, and the building collapsed further, trapping him, and he was trapped by his right leg. And unfortunately, the people that he was trying to save had died in those 3 days. And he was then trapped under their weight as well. So he was, someone came running to us when we were in another sector, and they had a video of him alive. And that, we were like, okay, we'll go straight there. And one of the UKISAR techs went in first, found him, and then called me forward. But what stopped me in my tracks was the fact that the two people that he'd been trying to rescue, a man and a woman, were dead next to him and kind of on top of him, but they were holding hands in the rubble. And that just, for 5 seconds, just stopped me. And then John, the UKISAR tech I was working with, was like, Deb, I need you here. And that, snapped me out of that. And I could then get on and help this guy.
I mean, just even listening to you there, actually, it's extremely emotive and moving to hear that. Could you maybe sort of speak to how much clinical medicine you did practice versus maybe, I don't know, hypothermia monitoring and or management? And was it more sort of fundamental basics, or was it quite advanced?
Initially, absolute basics. This guy that I was involved in was awake and talking, clearly trapped by his thigh. So, he looked dry. The UKISAR tech gave him a little bit of water because he was just begging for water, and he vomited that water. So we got access straight away, gave him an antiemetic, which then enabled him to keep the water down. We rehydrated him with some sodium chloride. We had a small monitor to do ECG monitoring, and if there's any changes on the ECG indicating that he was developing crush syndrome, then we have the calcium chloride, the Act Rapid, the glucose, all the stuff you need just to push the potassium back into the cells. We were concerned about his pelvis, and he was clearly in a lot of pain, so he had some fentanyl, which really helped him. He relaxed nicely with the fentanyl, and it was just the continuous reassurance whilst he was being dug out, and it was about a 3.5-4 hour extrication. And because we were light on our feet, we didn't have any heavy equipment at that point. We didn't have a stretcher to maneuver him out of the building. He had to go down a couple of floors. So we used a headboard, some rope, and some very skilled UKISAR techs to get him out of that building.
Could you speak to the sort of the supply and demand kind of curve, really? Were you faced with an overwhelming amount of demand, sort of clinical demand, and or did you have to set up a triage, sieve and or casualty clearing station, or was it literally one casualty at once and plenty of resources to match the demand?
Where we were tasked to, and the taskings that we had, there were not multiple casualties in one place. It was 1 or 2 people. And as soon as we got them out of whichever structure we were getting them out of, we handed them over to Turkish ambulance service to be taken to. Luckily, the large hospital was out of the city by the football stadium, so they were able to function from that perspective. So we handed them over. So there wasn't a need for us for like a casualty clearing area and to do triage.
For me, because I can imagine these extrications are prolonged and protracted, actually, and I suppose just from a self-care perspective, within the team, within the UKISAR team, did you have rotational shifts, or indeed periods of intense searching and or aid, and then coming out, and was that defined before you sort of committed yourself to the buildings?
There was no definition from that, but in the first 2 days, so we were split into 4 teams and given sectors within a sector. The first 2 days, all 4 teams were out. So usually we'd work on a rotation to give people rest, but there was absolutely no way any of us were going to have a cup of tea and a rest before we hit the ground. So we got into Gaziantep on Tuesday evening, drove through the night to get to Hatay, set up our base of operations in the early hours of the morning, and basically got into our PPE and got into the city. So, you know, it was like, it was a hit that we were willing to take and, you know, worry about it when you get home, type of thing. We did have, a prolonged extrication, of 2 people that were trapped in a building, and this was day 4 going into day 5, and it was a 20-hour operation to get them out. So we did rotate, so it was a 12 on, a few hours off, go back out again, and that rescue it can be seen on social media. It seems to be everywhere, which is great.
This is quite an emotive question, actually, and maybe quite a personal one around just whether you had to treat any pediatric patients and or, variety of pediatric patients. Did alive or dead, actually? Did you sort of witness quite a sort of emotive scene and or treat a lot of pediatrics?
I wasn't involved in any paediatric cases, but other team members were. Amelia Weaver, one of our other medical team members, was involved with a rescue of a mother and her 2-year-old daughter who were alive. But there were, we'd respond to good intel that people were still alive. And by the time we got there, they'd unfortunately died before we'd got there. So quite a few team members were involved in, children with parents that, they were either missing or they were, they hadn't survived.
So just reflecting back on the deployment and just talking to a few team members, you said some of these was their first deployment. What was the sort of mood from the team? Was it kind of shell shocked at the extent of devastation and the sort of clinical profile, or did you get a semblance that people were kind of taking it in their stride and the team was coming together? How did it sort of play out?
I think there was an absolute determination that we were not going to stop until we are told to stop. So whether that's, we're protecting ourselves from what we're seeing by keeping busy and helping people, there could be an element of that, but that's what we do. That's what we train for. We go through intense training. We go through, immersive training exercises, realistic training exercises. We're used to crawling around in confined spaces with live casualties and, and working together as a team. But what I would say that, the entire team, 77 of us, bonded, in a way that, none of us will be able to describe to you what that bond feels like. But I know that I've come away with 76 brothers and sisters.
Listen, that's powerful, actually, because, like you said, it's shared intense experiences, but that galvanise the team. You spoke to the sort of the physiological monitoring and indeed sort of the utility of small. Could you maybe speak to the kit, because it is bespoke kit for disasters such as you've got, I think, small compact monitors. You've got specific search and indeed medical kit which is concise. Could you maybe speak to the profile of the kit for listeners that might not be aware?
The monitoring we use is Tempus Pro, which is modular and small enough to get into tiny spaces, robust enough for me and firefighters to drop and survive. So yeah, that's what we use. We have an emergency medical bag, which has what you would expect on a enhanced critical care team bag in the UK, which it's a pain to carry around with your own kit. So, you've got about sort of 10 to 12 kilograms of your own kit plus a 17, 18 kilogram bag on top of that as well. But it's there to, to provide a kind of semi-advanced care primarily for the UKISAR techs if they have an accident, sustain a trauma or become unwell. But we all know that it's for the people that we're finding alive in the buildings. What I did because I didn't want to take the entire kit into the building, I just put it into bags of the things that I thought I would need. So tourniquets, some airway stuff, treatment for crush syndrome, analgesia, antiemetic, fluids. And then if I needed anything else from that, just call out, and then just get it, ferried into me. And that's just from experience of exercises in the past when I've either not taken enough or taken too much. So yeah, just kind of splitting it down to predicting what I'll need. And then, asking one of the UKISAR techs in the left-hand pocket down at the bottom or whatever, there should be a pelvic binder. Can you please send it up? So that's how I worked. So yeah.
Debs, could you speak to just how you communicated? Because Turkish is not entirely maybe dissimilar to the Arabic language. There's a lot of crossover, a lot of similarity. But I can imagine lots of the survivors and or local community may or may not speak English actually, and maybe just be speaking Turkish. But there's a lot of inferred reassurance just from nonverbal.
Yeah. So there was, a lot of non-verbal communication going on with just people in the street who are pulling you to go into a building to rescue people. And, if we put the search dogs over a building and they don't get a hit, it's breaking that news to people and sympathizing with them. And, that nothing beats eye contact, and just being sympathetic and few words. And if, I felt comfortable, then I would put my hand on someone's shoulder. The older Turkish women, I would hold their hands because I'm a woman, I can hold their hands. And that is enough. It's really weird. I felt that, we had an understanding between us just through empathy, really, and simple touch and eye contact. We were really lucky. We had volunteer interpreters, so ordinary everyday folk from all over Turkey had come to Hatay to offer their assistance for absolutely free. And they were invaluable to us. And again, without them, we wouldn't have been able to have done our job quite so easily. We had one guy called OJ who, when we had our prolonged 20-hour extrication of the two people that were still alive, he was crawling into the spaces because we could hear them. And he, untrained, a guy from Istanbul, crawling into the confined space that the UKISAR techs had made to get through to these people, and was talking to them and relaying information to me about their medical condition, and to the UKISAR techs about, what they're saying, what they're trapped under. And he was just, an unsung hero, along with all of the interpreters who joined us.
So Debs, as we sort of come into land on the conversation, just a couple more questions really. One is around sort of what you're going to take from that deployment, maybe within your nursing career or indeed your expedition career. Are there any sort of seminal points and or things you already knew but have been emphasized by the deployment?
I think my main takeaway from this deployment is the generosity of the people of Hatay. They had nothing, and they were offering us tea and food, and they were handing out rubble gloves, to us, which we didn't need, but it was unbelievable. They had nothing, and yet they were still being hospitable and generous and kind. And that in its that in itself would, make us a little bit like, suddenly we've got an acute attack of hay fever here. Our eyes are watering. And, people were sharing their stories with us. They were telling us about how their family had died in, a few buildings up the street, but thank you for being here, and thank you for trying, and keep doing what you're doing. It was humbling. it was really, really humbling. And I had two moments of thinking that I might die at this point. Was when I was in a collapsed structure and there was a 3.2 aftershock, and we had to move quickly out of that building. And that I haven't felt fear like that before. That was incredible fear. And there was another incident where it was probably just coming up to midnight. There's no electricity in the city. And suddenly we just heard a roar of people running towards us and past us, including the police and the military. People are screaming at us to move. And you could, the fear and the panic was palpable. And someone said that a dam had burst and that there was water coming down because we were by the river. So we just all ran. We dropped everything and ran. And on those two occasions, I just thought, oh, is this it? And I wonder if it's going to hurt. And that was it. It's surreal experiences. So they'll stick with me as well. But I think that the prevailing feeling that I have from being in Turkey, very near to the Syrian border, was the generosity and the hospitality of a group of people who had lost everything.
Finally, Debs, as we do come into land, could you just maybe speak to the debrief and a wash up that you guys had sort of as a UKISAR team, and maybe what was discussed, what was learnt, and indeed what was taken away?
So discussed, we didn't discuss much. I think typical gallows humour, there was a lot of laughter about things, particularly the running away from a burst dam that actually didn't exist. But because we'd bonded, everyone has said, we need to keep in contact. We're brothers and sisters now. If anyone's struggling, if anyone's got any problems, then you just reach out. Each of the fire and rescue services have systems in place for their employees. But as the medical team, because we all work for the NHS, we have a structural engineer and we have a vet. None of us are attached to a fire and rescue service, but we are adopted by our local UKISAR stations. So we can tap into that. They did offer trim, for people kind of on deployment. There were a few trim practitioners who were offering, time with people. But it was camaraderie and, eating together, in the mess tent, and talking through the day. And we had a day and a half waiting for a flight to come and get us. So that was almost like a decompression time as well, just catching up. And but the dogs most definitely were a tonic.
Debs, listen, thank you for your reflections. It's really good to hear just your anecdotal experience and account, and just your reflections from what sounds like an extremely intense experience. So thank you.
Thanks, Owen.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to. Please also head over to the World Extreme Medicine website, where you can find more engaging content on extreme medicine webinars and indeed a collection of courses from our global network, including humanitarian, disaster relief, expedition, space, military, tactical, and performance medicine. Thanks again.